For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The early morning mist clung to the Kentucky hills as Troy Morgan strode through his fields, his boots crunching softly against the frost-laden soil. Halfway through his usual path, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer amid the dirt and dead leaves. He stopped, narrowing his eyes. At first, he thought it was a shard of glass or a trick of the light, but as he knelt to inspect it, the object revealed itself in full. It was a stone. No, a gem. About the size of his palm, it shimmered with a soft, inner glow, shifting between hues of silver and violet as he tilted it in the dim light. It didn't look like anything he'd seen before. Its surface was impossibly smooth, as though polished by hands more precise than any human craftsman's. "What the hell are you?" Troy muttered to himself, turning the gem over in his calloused hands. For a brief moment, he considered leaving it there, but curiosity won out. Pocketing the strange object, he decided he'd show it to the town jeweler later. Maybe it was some kind of rare crystal, and if luck was on his side, it might be worth something. As he walked back toward his farmhouse, he had no way of knowing that by picking up the gem, he'd set off a chain of events that would turn his life upside down. Far above the earth, beyond the grasp of human telescopes, a ship cruised silently through the void. Zara stood in the command chamber, her black hair falling in sharp, angular strands around her face, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic projection before her. The tear of the first, the sacred relic that symbolized her people's unity, had been stolen from its sanctuary. Its faint energy signature now pulsed from a remote planet, Earth. Her orders were clear: retrieve the tear and eliminate anyone who had come into contact with it. Failure was not an option. Do not return empty-handed, huntress. Your honor and your life depend on it. She entered the docking bay, her steps purposeful. A transport pod hummed to life as she stepped inside, its interior dimly lit by violet panels. As the pod launched toward Earth, Zara's thoughts sharpened into singular focus. The tear was her people's most sacred artifact, and she would do whatever it took to bring it back, even if it meant taking the life of the human who had dared to claim it. Troy sat on the edge of his porch that evening, staring at the gem. Its glow had dimmed slightly, but it was still mesmerizing. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strange pull toward it. The sharp snap of a twig echoed through the cold night air, pulling Troy out of his daze. His grip tightened on the shotgun as his eyes darted to the shadowy tree line bordering his farm. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm, carrying just enough edge to send a warning. No answer. Troy took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a deer or a stray dog. Something felt off. His instinct, honed by years of working this land and knowing its every sound, told him so. Then she stepped into the open. Troy froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Her skin, a shimmering shade of blue, gleamed faintly, as though it absorbed and reflected the night's light. Black hair fell in sharp, angular strands around her face, framing features that were both strikingly human and unmistakably alien. Her dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. Troy raised the shotgun instinctively, though his hands were trembling. "What the hell are you?" The woman stopped several feet away, her posture poised and commanding, as though she was entirely unfazed by the weapon pointed at her chest. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting down to the barrel of the shotgun before meeting his eyes again. "You have something that belongs to me," she said, her voice low and melodic, yet carrying an edge of authority that cut through the stillness. "I don't know who or what you are," he said, keeping his voice steady, "but I don't have anything of yours. So why don't you turn around and leave before we have a problem?" Her lips curved into a faint smirk, though her eyes remained cold. "You're lying," she said simply. Troy took a cautious step back, his mind racing. He thought of the strange gem tucked in his pocket, the one he'd found in the field that morning. It couldn't be what she was after, could it? "I don't know what you're talking about," he said firmly. Her smirk faded, replaced by a hard, calculating look. "The tear of the first," she said, her tone sharp now. "You found it. I can feel its energy. It's on you." Troy's pulse quickened. He tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Listen, lady," he growled. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't have time for this." "Human arrogance," she said, almost to herself, her expression hardening. "Always so quick to think you're in control." Troy's patience snapped. "I don't know what kind of crazy alien nonsense this is, but you're trespassing on my land. You've got 3 seconds to walk away before I—" She moved. One moment, she was standing several feet away, The next, she was directly in front of him, her movements so fast they were a blur. Her hand shot out, gripping the barrel of his shotgun with an iron-like strength. Troy tried to pull back, but her grip was unyielding. Before he could react, she twisted the weapon out of his hands as though it weighed nothing. The shotgun clattered to the ground, useless. His heart pounded as he stumbled back, instinctively reaching for his pocket, but she was faster. Her hand shot out again, this time grabbing his wrist and stopping him in his tracks. "Enough!" she said sharply, her dark eyes boring into his. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Troy glared at her, his free hand balling into a fist. "Let go of me." Her grip tightened. "I've been sent to retrieve the tear," she said, her voice colder now. "You have two choices, human. Surrender it willingly, or what?" Troy spat, cutting her off. "You'll kill me?" Her expression didn't change. "If I have to." Before she could react, Troy swung his free hand, aiming for her jaw. It wasn't his cleanest punch, but it was enough to startle her. She released his wrist, stumbling back slightly. Troy didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged for the shotgun, scooping it up from the ground. He spun around, raising it to his shoulder, but before he could take aim, she raised her arm, and a sharp, violet light erupted from the device strapped to her wrist. The blast struck him square in the chest. The impact wasn't like a bullet, or even a punch. He hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him, his vision blurred, and his limbs felt like lead. He tried to move, to fight, but his body refused to obey. Through the haze, he saw her approaching. Her expression was unreadable as she knelt beside him, reaching into his jacket pocket. Her fingers brushed against the gem, and she pulled it free, holding it up to the moonlight. The tear shimmered faintly. "I warned you," she said softly, almost regretfully. Troy's head lolled to the side as the darkness closed in. The last thing he saw was her face, framed by the cold light of the gem, before everything went black. Troy's head pounded as he stirred awake, his vision swimming in and out of focus. The faint hum of machinery filled his ears, and the cold, sterile air stung his lungs. He blinked, groaning softly, and tried to move, but his arms and legs were restrained. He was sitting in a chair, metal cuffs locking his wrists and ankles in place. The room around him was dimly lit. Across the room, Zara stood, her back to him. She was staring at a sleek console embedded in the wall, her posture rigid. The tear of the first rested on a nearby table, its glow pulsing faintly. Troy tested his restraints, gritting his teeth against the pressure of the cold metal. "You've got a funny way of saying thank you," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Zara turned sharply, her dark eyes locking onto his. "You should consider yourself lucky," she said coldly. "If it were anyone else sent to retrieve the tear, you'd already be dead." Troy smirked, despite the ache in his chest. "Well, aren't I just blessed?" Her expression darkened, and she crossed the room in a few swift steps, standing over him with a presence that made his skin prickle. She leaned in close, her sharp black hair framing her face. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low and seething with restrained fury. "That artifact isn't just a shiny trinket you stumbled across in your field. It's a key, a source of power that could bring destruction to your entire planet if mishandled." Troy's smirk faded, his brow furrowing. "A key? To what?" "To everything," she replied cryptically. Straightening, she folded her arms across her chest, her gaze never leaving his. "It's tied to the foundation of Zarathii civilization. It was stolen from its sanctuary, and now it's in the hands of someone who doesn't even know what it is." Troy's jaw tightened. "Well, maybe if you'd bothered to explain instead of zapping me with your fancy wristwatch, we wouldn't be here." Zara tilted her head, studying him with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "You're remarkably defiant for someone in your position." "Defiant?" Troy scoffed. "Lady, you tied me to a chair in some alien bunker. What do you expect, a thank you note?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she said nothing. The faint hum of the room filled the silence between them. Finally, she spoke. "I need to know how you found it." Troy frowned. "I told you. It was just there, half buried in the dirt." "Artifacts like this don't just appear out of nowhere," Zara snapped. "Did you see anyone else? Anything unusual? Besides you?" He shot back. Her patience was wearing thin. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands curled into fists at her sides. Troy leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow, his voice softening slightly. "You're not just here for the tear, are you?" Her eyes flickered, a brief crack in her otherwise stoic facade. "What are you talking about?" "You're scared," he said, watching her closely. Not just for this thing, for yourself. You've got a lot riding on this, don't you? Zara's expression hardened, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she turned away, pacing the length of the room. My people don't tolerate failure, she said finally, her voice quieter now. If I don't return the tier, the council will label me as weak, as expendable. Troy watched her, the pieces beginning to fall into place. So this isn't just about saving your civilization. It's about saving yourself. She stopped, her back still to him. You wouldn't understand. Try me, he said simply. Zara hesitated, her fingers flexing at her sides. When she finally turned to face him, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her dark eyes, a glimpse of the person beneath the hardened exterior. I was born into service, she said, her voice distant. Trained from childhood to obey, to fight, to hunt. The council gave me everything and took everything in return. My honor, my life, my choices, they all belong to them. Troy's chest tightened. Despite himself, he felt a pang of sympathy for her. Sounds like a raw deal. Her gaze sharpened, and just like that, the crack in her armor closed. It's the only life I know, she said curtly, and I'll do whatever it takes to complete my mission, even if it means sacrificing you. Troy leaned back in the chair, his smirk returning. You keep saying that, but I'm still here. Makes me think you're not as cold as you want me to believe. Zari stepped closer, her expression icy. Don't mistake my restraint for weakness, human. You're alive because you might still be useful. That's all. Before Troy could respond, the faint hum of the room shifted, growing louder. Zara stiffened, her head snapping toward the console. What's happening? Troy asked, his voice tense. Zara didn't answer. She moved quickly to the console, her fingers flying over the glowing controls. Her expression darkened as she read the data scrolling across the screen. We're not alone, she said, her voice grim. Troy's stomach sank. What does that mean? It means, she said, turning to face him, that someone just found us, and they're not here for a friendly visit. Care to explain what's happening? He said, his voice sharp. Zara shot him a glare over her shoulder. A Zarathii hunter ship is entering the atmosphere. It's an assassin vessel. Troy frowned. And that's bad, I take it? Bad, Zara echoed with a bitter laugh. Bad doesn't begin to cover it. They're not here to help me. They're here to eliminate me. Troy's heart skipped a beat. Wait, your own people are coming after you? Zara turned from the console, her dark eyes blazing. I told you before, failure is not an option for the Zarathii Council. They've decided I'm expendable. If I don't return the tier, they'll kill me and retrieve it themselves. Troy shook his head, his disbelief turning into anger. So, they sent you here to do their dirty work, and now they're just gonna wipe you out? What the hell kind of system is that? One that doesn't tolerate weakness, Zara said coldly, though there was a flicker of something vulnerable in her tone. The room shook slightly, the hum growing louder. Zara returned to the console, her fingers tapping a final command before she turned to Troy. We need to leave, now. Troy raised an eyebrow, gesturing to the cuffs restraining him. You think I'm going anywhere like this? Zara hesitated, her jaw tightening. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she crossed the room and tapped a button on her wrist device. The restraints clicked open, and Troy's arms and legs were freed. As he stood, rubbing his wrists, he smirked at her. See? You do have a heart in there somewhere. Don't push your luck, she snapped, though she didn't stop him as he grabbed the discarded shotgun from the corner of the room. The tier still sat on the table, glowing faintly. Zara grabbed it, slipping it into a compartment on her belt. Stay close, she ordered, and try not to get yourself killed. I was about to say the same to you, Troy muttered, following her toward a door that slid open with a hiss. The two stepped out into the dense Kentucky woods. The night was dark and cold, the air heavy with the promise of violence. Overhead, the sky was split by a streak of violet light, a ship descending through the atmosphere. Zara glanced up, her expression grim. They'll land close. We have maybe 5 minutes before they reach us. And what's the plan exactly? Troy asked, gripping the shotgun tightly. Zara turned to him, her gaze unwavering. The plan is simple. Survive. The hunter ship touched down in a nearby clearing, its sleek black hull reflecting the moonlight. The craft hummed ominously as a hatch slid open and a figure emerged. The Zarathii assassin was taller than Zara, his blue skin a deeper, almost metallic hue. His armor glinted like polished obsidian. Zara, the assassin called, his voice echoing through the trees. The council has decreed your failure. Surrender the tier, and I'll make your death swift. Zara crouched behind a fallen log, her breathing steady but her fingers flexing at her sides. Troy crouched beside her, glancing nervously between her and the approaching assassin. "This guy looks like he means business," Troy whispered. "He does," Zara replied quietly, "and he won't stop until one of us is dead." Troy tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Well, I'm not planning on dying tonight. Got any bright ideas?" Zara reached into a pouch on her belt, pulling out a small cylindrical device. "Distract him," she said simply, handing it to Troy. He stared at the device, then back at her. "Distract him? With this? What the hell is it?" "A flash charge," Zara said, her tone clipped. "It'll blind him for a few seconds. That's all the time I need to take him down." Troy swallowed hard, glancing at the assassin who was closing in. "Right. No pressure then." Zara gave him a sharp look. "You wanted to help, didn't you?" Troy nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, just didn't think it'd be against a 7-foot alien hitman. Welcome to my world," Zara muttered. Troy took a deep breath, steeling himself. Then, before he could overthink it, he stood and hurled the flash charge towards the assassin. The device detonated in midair, releasing a blinding burst of light that lit up the entire forest. The assassin staggered back, his weapon lowered as he tried to shield his glowing eyes. Zara moved. In a blur of motion, she darted toward the assassin, her wrist device glowing as it discharged a concentrated pulse of energy. The blast struck the assassin square in the chest, sending him stumbling backward, but he recovered quickly, his weapon snapping up to fire a crackling beam of energy at her. Zara rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast, and closed the distance between them. Troy watched, his heart hammering in his chest, as the two Zarathii clashed. The assassin was stronger, his strikes brutal and calculated, but Zara was faster, her movements fluid and precise. She dodged another swing of his weapon, slipping inside his guard and driving her elbow into his side. The assassin snarled, his glowing eyes blazing as he swung his arm, catching Zara across the jaw and sending her sprawling to the ground. Troy didn't think. He raised the shotgun and fired. The blast struck the assassin in the shoulder, staggering him. He turned toward Troy, his eyes narrowing with fury. "Oh, hell," Troy muttered, scrambling to reload. Before the assassin could advance, Zara rose behind him, her wrist device glowing. She unleashed another pulse of energy, this one striking the back of his head. The assassin collapsed to the ground, unmoving. Zara stood over him, breathing heavily, her dark eyes cold. "Stay down," she muttered. Troy exhaled sharply, lowering the shotgun. "Well, that was fun." Zara turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "You handled yourself better than I expected." "Yeah, well, I've had a lot of practice with trespassers," Troy said with a faint smirk. Zara allowed herself a small smile before turning serious. "We need to keep moving. The council won't stop with just one assassin." Troy nodded, his smirk fading. "Then let's not stick around for the encore." Together, they disappeared into the forest, the tear glowing faintly at Zara's side. The forest was quiet now, except for the sound of their hurried footsteps crunching through the frosty underbrush. Zara moved with precise, calculated grace, scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. Behind her, Troy followed, the shotgun slung over his shoulder, his sharp breaths visible in the cold air. "How far are we going?" he asked after a few minutes, his voice breaking the silence. "As far as we need to," Zara replied without looking back. Troy frowned, glancing over his shoulder. The hunter ship's faint glow was still visible in the distance, casting a sinister light against the horizon. "And what happens when they send more of those guys? Because something tells me they're not just going to give up." "They won't," Zara admitted, "but we'll be harder to track if we keep moving. The tier's energy signature is faint for now, but the council will send more operatives once they realize their assassin failed." Troy let out a low whistle. "Great. So we're just running until they catch us?" Zara stopped suddenly, turning to face him. "If you'd rather go back to your farm and wait for them to burn it to the ground, be my guest. But if you stay with me, you might actually have a chance of surviving this." Troy met her gaze, his jaw tightening. He didn't like being told what to do, especially by someone who had knocked him out and dragged him into this mess. But he couldn't deny the truth in her words. Staying behind wasn't an option anymore. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "But if we're going to keep running, maybe you could tell me what the plan is, or do you not have one?" Zara's eyes narrowed. "My plan was to retrieve the tier and return to my people, but that's no longer an option." "Why not?" "Because they've branded me a traitor," she said, her voice colder now. "Even if I deliver the tier, the council won't forgive my failure. They'll kill me, and then they'll destroy your planet to cover their tracks." Troy stared at her, a cold knot forming in his stomach. So what you're saying is, we're screwed. Zara's lips pressed into a thin line. Not necessarily. There's one place we can go where the council won't find us. And where's that? She hesitated, as though the words tasted bitter. Your people have something called a satellite installation, a facility designed to monitor space. If we can access it, I can send a transmission to a Zarathii faction opposed to the council. They might be willing to help. Troy raised an eyebrow. And how do you know about our satellites? I've been monitoring your planet for years, she said simply, as though it were obvious. Of course you have, Troy muttered. So let me get this straight. You want to sneak into a top-secret government facility and use it to call some alien resistance group for backup? Yes, Zara said without hesitation. Troy let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. You're insane. Zara's gaze hardened. Do you have a better idea? Troy opened his mouth to reply but stopped himself. He didn't have a better idea, not yet, anyway. Didn't think so, Zara said, her tone edged with satisfaction. She turned and started walking again, leaving Troy to follow. By the time they stopped to rest, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. They had reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a small valley, the dense forest, stretching as far as the eye could see. Zara leaned against a tree, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She was clearly exhausted, but she masked it well, her expression as unreadable as ever. Troy dropped to the ground, resting his back against a boulder. His muscles ached, and the adrenaline that had kept him going all night was beginning to fade. You do this often? He asked, his voice laced with dry humor. Running for your life? Fighting assassins? Plotting to break into government facilities? Zara glanced at him, her dark eyes narrowing. You talk too much. Troy smirked. You know, for someone who's supposed to be this badass alien huntress, you're awfully grumpy. She didn't respond, her gaze drifting to the horizon. For a moment, her usual cold demeanor softened, and Troy caught a glimpse of something deeper, something raw and unguarded. You're not used to this, are you? He said, his tone quieter now. She frowned, looking back at him. What are you talking about? Not being in control, he said simply. Having to rely on someone else. Zara's jaw tightened, and she turned away. I don't rely on anyone. Sure you don't, Troy said, leaning back against the boulder. That's why you didn't leave me tied to that chair back there. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, but she didn't argue. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at the horizon, the tension in her posture making it clear she didn't want to continue the conversation. Troy watched her for a moment, then sighed and leaned his head back. Despite her prickly exterior, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for her. She was tough, no doubt about it, but there was more to her than she let on. And whether he liked it or not, they were in this mess together now. Later that night, as they sat around a small fire, hidden in the shelter of the rocky outcrop, the conversation turned unexpectedly personal. Troy had just finished eating a piece of dried meat from his pack when he glanced at Zara, who was staring into the flames with a distant look in her eyes. Why'd you do it? He asked suddenly. She looked up, her brow furrowing. Do what? Sign up for this, he said, gesturing vaguely. Becoming a huntress, working for people who treat you like you're disposable. Zara hesitated, her gaze dropping back to the fire. It wasn't a choice. I was born into it. My people value strength and discipline above all else. I was trained to serve the council from the moment I could walk. And you never thought about walking away? She let out a bitter laugh. There's no walking away from the council. Not unless you want to spend the rest of your life being hunted. Troy studied her for a moment, the firelight casting shadows across her face. Well, for what it's worth, I think they're idiots for turning on you. You're not half bad when you're not threatening to kill me, that is. Zara looked at him, her dark eyes softening slightly. Don't get used to it, she said, but there was the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. For the first time since this whole ordeal had started, Troy felt a flicker of something other than fear or anger. It wasn't quite trust, but it was the beginning of something. The fire burned low as the cold night deepened, its flickering light casting shadows across the rocky outcrop. The forest around them was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Zara sat with her back against a boulder, her sharp, dark eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. She was alert, always on guard, but there was a quiet in her posture now, a weariness she could no longer hide. Troy sat across from her, poking at the embers with a stick. His muscles ached from the night's events, but he was still awake, unable to sleep. The events of the past day replayed in his mind, finding the tear, meeting Zara, the fight with the assassin. It felt like a fever dream, something out of a story too wild to believe. But the proof was right in front of him. He glanced at Zara, her blue skin gleaming faintly in the firelight. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten, a mixture of strength and grace that was as alien as it was captivating. She had saved his life, even if she wouldn't admit it, and for all her cold demeanor, there was a fire in her, a spark of something that drew him in. "You don't sleep much, do you?" he said, breaking the silence. She didn't look at him, her gaze still fixed on the trees. "I can't afford to." Troy raised an eyebrow. "Even out here? You think another one of your people is going to drop out of the sky tonight?" "It's not impossible," Zara replied. "The council doesn't waste time when it comes to retrieving the tier. If another ship is on its way, we won't have much warning." Troy leaned back against a log, letting out a sigh. "You ever get tired of it? Always looking over your shoulder?" She hesitated, her hands resting loosely on her knees. "It's all I've ever known," she said softly. "That's not what I asked," Troy pressed. Zara's gaze finally shifted to him, her dark eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you care?" "Because I'm stuck in this mess with you," Troy said, his tone blunt but not unkind. "And because I think you're not as cold as you pretend to be." She let out a soft, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't know me, human." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know what it looks like when someone's carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. I've seen it before." Zara's expression softened, just for a moment. She looked away, her gaze dropping to the fire. "You think I have a choice in this?" "Everyone has a choice," Troy said. She shook her head. "Not in my world. I was born into this role, trained to be a huntress, to obey the council's orders without question. They decide who lives and who dies, and I'm the one who carries out their will. That's how it works. And you're okay with that?" Her jaw tightened, and for a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she said quietly, "I don't know anymore." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. For the first time, Zara didn't look like an unstoppable huntress or a cold, unfeeling warrior. She looked human. Troy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe it's time you stopped running from them, stopped letting them decide who you are." She met his gaze, her dark eyes searching his face. "And what do you suggest? That I abandon everything I've ever known? That I just walk away?" "Why not?" Troy said. "You've already gone this far. Hell, you're out here saving my sorry ass instead of handing me over to them. You're not as loyal to them as you think." Zara's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "You're infuriating," she muttered. Troy grinned. "Yeah, I get that a lot." She shook her head, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. For the first time since they'd met, she didn't seem like she was holding the world at arm's length. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the stillness of the night. They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them shifting into something else, something unspoken, but undeniable. Zara broke the silence, her voice low. "You're different from the others." Troy raised an eyebrow. "What others?" "Humans," she said simply. "The ones I've observed, the ones the council considers inferior. They're fragile, arrogant. But you..." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're stubborn, resilient. You don't give up, even when you should." Troy chuckled softly. "Not sure if that's a compliment or an insult." "It's both," Zara said, a faint smirk crossing her lips. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in her dark eyes, and felt a warmth he hadn't expected. For all her sharp edges and cold demeanor, there was something vulnerable beneath the surface, something she tried to hide, but couldn't completely bury. "You're not so bad yourself," he said quietly. She arched an eyebrow, but there was no mockery in her tone when she replied, "Careful, Troy. I might start to believe you." They sat in silence again, the moment stretching between them. The fire burned lower, its light dimming, but neither of them moved. Zara's gaze softened as she looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the dark forest and the crackling fire, the barriers between them seemed to fade. Troy's gaze lingered on Zara, his pulse quickening as the distance between them seemed to shrink. Her dark eyes held his, unflinching, as though she were searching for something she had never allowed herself to need before. Zara leaned back slightly, her usual composure faltering for a fraction of a second. "You're staring," she said softly, her voice losing some of its usual sharpness. "Can't help it," Troy replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not every day I get saved by a blue-skinned alien huntress. She rolled her eyes, though the corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Is everything a joke to you? Not everything, Troy said, his tone quieter now. His eyes softened as he looked at her, the firelight casting warm shadows across her sharp features. You're not what I expected. Zara arched an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. What did you expect, Troy? A monster? A machine? Someone incapable of feeling? He didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to her hands, which rested lightly on her knees. For all her strength, there was a gentleness in her now, a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. No, he said finally, his voice low. I think I expected someone who wouldn't care. But you do, don't you? Zara's breath hitched, barely noticeable, and her lips parted as if to deny it. But she didn't. Instead, she looked away, her hands tightening into fists. You don't know what you're talking about, she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Troy leaned forward, closing the gap between them. I think I do, he said. I think you're tired of running, tired of doing what they tell you, of being what they want you to be. Her gaze snapped back to him, her dark eyes flashing. You think it's that simple? She said, her voice laced with bitterness. You think I can just stop being what they made me? Yes, he said firmly, because you already have. The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Zara's chest rose and fell, her breathing unsteady as she stared at him. You're infuriating, she said again, but this time her voice was softer, almost trembling. Troy smiled faintly, his hand reaching out to brush a stray strand of black hair from her face. Yeah, I get that a lot. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment as though trying to steady herself, and when she opened them again, the fire in her gaze was different. I've never, she began, her voice faltering. She swallowed hard, her eyes searching his. I've never been with a human before. Troy's breath caught, his heart pounding in his chest. And, he asked, his voice rough but gentle. She hesitated, her walls crumbling one by one. And I don't know what I'm doing, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to, Troy said softly, his hand moving to cup her face. We'll figure it out together. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was electric, charged with something neither of them could put into words. Then, slowly, Zara leaned in. The first touch of her lips was tentative, almost unsure, but it quickly deepened as the tension between them gave way to something neither of them could resist. Her hands found his shoulders, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as though grounding herself. Troy's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer as the kiss grew hungrier, more urgent. Her body pressed against his, warm and solid, her breath mingling with his as they surrendered to the moment. The world around them seemed to fade, the firelight flickering in the background, as the only reality that mattered was the connection between them. Zara's control, so carefully maintained, shattered as she let herself feel for the first time in what felt like forever. Her voice, usually so sharp and commanding, softened as she whispered his name, her breath warm against his ear. Troy. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes. You okay? He asked, his voice husky but full of concern. She nodded, her hands sliding up to cup his face. This is the most real I've ever felt, she confessed, her voice trembling with emotion. You're unlike anyone I've ever known. Troy smiled, his thumb brushing against her cheek. Right back at you, Zara. Their lips met again, and this time, there was no hesitation. Their movements were fluid, instinctive, as though they had always been meant to find each other. The heat between them built steadily, their bodies moving in sync as they gave in completely. The cold night air was forgotten as their shared warmth enveloped them, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Zara's skin, so smooth and unearthly, glistened faintly in the dim light, and Troy marveled at the beauty of her, his hands tracing the curve of her back. She pressed closer, her voice a soft, breathless murmur against his neck. I've never felt anything like this, she admitted, her words raw and unguarded. You're perfect, Troy finished for her, his voice thick with emotion. You're perfect. Zara let out a soft laugh, her forehead resting against his. You're not so bad yourself, she said, her tone teasing but full of affection. The hours stretched on, the forest around them silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the soft sounds of their shared connection. By the time they finally rested, their bodies entwined. They were both drenched in sweat, their breaths still mingling as they lay together under the stars. For the first time in years, Zara felt truly alive, unburdened by duty or fear. And as she rested her head against Troy's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she whispered, "You've changed everything." Troy pressed a gentle kiss to her hair, his arms tightening around her. "So have you," he murmured. Together, they drifted into a peaceful silence, the weight of their struggles momentarily forgotten as they found solace in each other's arms. The first light of dawn broke through the dense forest, casting long shadows across the rocky outcrop where Troy and Zara rested. Zara stirred first, her instincts pulling her from the fragile comfort of sleep. She sat up, her body tense as her dark eyes scanned the trees, her huntress reflexes returning with a vengeance. Despite the warmth she had felt during the night, reality came rushing back like a cold wind. Troy blinked awake a moment later, his arms still resting on Zara's waist. He stretched, groaning softly as the aches of the previous day caught up with him. "You're up early," he murmured, his voice groggy but tinged with warmth. Zara didn't respond immediately. She stood, her back to him, her posture rigid as she watched the horizon. Troy sat up, his brows furrowing. "Zara, they'll come," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "More of them. I can feel it." Troy sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're really good at killing a mood, you know that?" She turned to face him, her expression hard. "This isn't a mood, Troy. This is survival. What happened last night?" She hesitated, her gaze softening for just a moment before she forced herself to continue. "It doesn't change the fact that we're in danger." Troy stood, his jaw tightening as he grabbed his shotgun. "I know that. Believe me, I haven't forgotten the part where we're being hunted by alien assassins. But maybe, just for a second, you could let yourself feel something other than fear." Zara's eyes flashed with something unreadable, and she looked away. "Feelings won't save us." "Maybe not," Troy said, stepping closer to her, "but they give us a reason to fight." She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Troy sighed, lowering his voice. "What's the plan, Zara? You said we'd head for the satellite installation. Is that still the play?" She nodded, her tone clipped. "Yes, it's our only chance. If we can contact the Zarathii resistance, they might help us. But it won't be easy. The installation is heavily guarded." "Great," Troy muttered. "Nothing like breaking into a government facility to start the day." Zara's lips twitched in what might have been a smirk. "You're still here, aren't you?" Troy shrugged. "Well, I'm not about to let you face this alone. Besides, you'd be lost without me." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're insufferable, and you're stuck with me," he replied, a faint grin crossing his lips. The journey to the satellite installation took hours. The forest gave way to rolling hills, and eventually, the rugged terrain opened up to reveal a massive complex nestled in a valley. The installation was a sprawling facility, surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. Towers equipped with searchlights loomed over the perimeter, and the hum of machinery echoed faintly in the distance. Troy whistled softly, crouching beside Zara on a ridge overlooking the facility. "Well, that's intimidating." Zara's expression was unreadable as she surveyed the complex. "The guards will be the least of our problems. The satellite uplink is heavily encrypted. I'll need time to override it." "How much time?" "Too much," she admitted. Troy frowned. "And let me guess those assassins are still tracking us?" "They're always tracking us," Zara said grimly. "Perfect," Troy muttered, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "So we're breaking into a top-secret facility while being hunted by alien death squads. Just another Tuesday." Zara ignored his sarcasm, her dark eyes narrowing as she studied the facility. "We'll need a distraction to get past the guards." Troy raised an eyebrow. "And by we, you mean me, right?" Her lips curved into a faint smirk. "You're catching on." "Great," he said, shaking his head. "Any particular way you want me to risk my life? Or should I just wing it?" "Wing it," she said simply. Troy sighed, muttering under his breath. "Why do I feel like I'm going to regret this?" The plan unfolded with chaotic precision. While Zara slipped around the perimeter, moving like a shadow, Troy approached the facility's main gate with a mix of nerves and bravado. He had rigged a crude explosive from supplies in his pack, nothing lethal, just enough to create a loud bang and draw attention. As he set the device near the fence, his hands shook slightly, but he forced himself to focus. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, pressing the detonator. The explosion was small but deafening, sending a plume of dirt and smoke into the air. Alarms blared instantly, and the guards near the gate sprang into action, rushing toward the source of the commotion. Troy ducked into the shadows, his heart racing as he watched the chaos unfold. He could only hope Zara was making progress. Inside the facility, Zara moved with precision and purpose. The guards were distracted, their attention focused on the explosion, giving her a narrow window to reach the satellite uplink. The control room was small but packed with advanced technology. Zara's fingers flew over the console, her wrist device interfacing with the system as she worked to bypass the encryption. "Come on," she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. The tear of the first pulsed faintly at her side, its energy resonating with the uplink. Zara's eyes narrowed as she realized the artifact was amplifying her signal, boosting the connection. Finally, the screen flickered, and a stream of alien text appeared. Zara's heart raced as she entered the coordinates for the Zarathii resistance. "Message sent," she whispered, relief flooding her. But the moment was short-lived. The door behind her burst open, and two armed guards stormed in, their weapons trained on her. Zara didn't hesitate. She spun, disarming the first guard with a fluid motion before delivering a swift kick to the second, sending him crashing into the console. The room erupted into chaos as alarms blared louder, but Zara held her ground, her movements precise and deadly. Outside, Troy watched in horror as a sleek black ship descended from the sky, its hull gleaming ominously in the sunlight. "Zara," he muttered, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The assassins had arrived. The black ship descended with eerie silence, its massive bulk casting a shadow over the valley. Troy's heart pounded as he crouched behind a boulder, gripping the shotgun tightly. The guards, who had been swarming toward his distraction, froze, their attention shifting skyward as the alien craft touched down in a cloud of dust and energy. From its hull, a ramp lowered, and 3 Zarathii assassins emerged. Clad in sleek black armor that glinted in the daylight, their movements were fluid, their glowing eyes scanning the facility with cold precision. Each carried weapons bristling with energy, far more advanced than anything Troy could fathom. "Well, this just keeps getting better," Troy muttered under his breath. His instincts screamed at him to run, to abandon this insane mission, and hope the assassins wouldn't bother chasing him. But then he thought of Zara, inside the facility, fighting alone to send her message. She had risked everything, not just for herself, but for him, for his planet. He couldn't leave her. Troy tightened his grip on the shotgun and forced himself to move, skirting the edge of the facility's perimeter. The guards, overwhelmed by the arrival of the Zarathii assassins, had abandoned their posts, leaving parts of the fence unguarded. He slipped inside, his heart racing as he moved toward the control room where Zara had gone. Inside the facility, Zara fought with relentless precision. The 2 guards she had taken down earlier were unconscious on the floor, but the alarms blaring through the building told her reinforcements weren't far behind. She wiped blood from the corner of her mouth, her breathing ragged as she turned back to the console. The message had been sent, but there was no guarantee the Zarathii resistance had received it or that they would respond in time. The tear pulsed faintly at her side, its energy flickering as though reacting to her rising fear. Zara clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to doubt. Not now. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and she turned just as Troy burst through the door. "About time," she said, her tone sharp but laced with relief. "Good to see you too," Troy replied, his chest heaving as he slammed the door behind him. "I hope you've got a plan, because the cavalry's here, and they're not friendly." Zara's expression darkened. "The assassins." Troy nodded grimly. 3 of them, and they're packing some serious hardware. Zara's mind raced. The tier was too dangerous to leave behind, but fighting 3 trained assassins head-on was suicide, even for her. "We can't fight them," she said. "Not directly." Troy raised an eyebrow. "Then what do we do? Run?" "No," Zara said firmly. "We lure them away from the tier. If they think they have it, they'll stop hunting us, at least for now." Troy frowned, glancing at the glowing artifact on her belt. "And how do we make them think that?" Zara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pouch and pulled out a small, spherical device. Its surface shimmered faintly, and Troy recognized it as one of the alien gadgets she had used earlier. "What's that?" he asked. "A decoy," Zara said. She pressed a sequence of buttons, and the sphere emitted a pulse of light, creating a perfect holographic replica of the tier. She handed it to Troy. Take this. Lead them away from the facility. I'll cover you." Troy stared at her, his jaw tightening. "And what happens to you?" "I'll hold them off," Zara said, her voice steady. "They'll come for me once they realize the message has been sent, but you'll have a chance to escape." "No," Troy said, his tone firm. "We do this together. You're not sacrificing yourself for me." Zara's dark eyes softened, and for a moment, the steel in her gaze wavered. "Troy, no," he said again, stepping closer. "I didn't come this far just to lose you. We're getting out of this, both of us." She stared at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his voice. For all her strength, for all her training, she had never known what it was to have someone fight for her, not because of duty or obligation, but because they cared. "Together, then," she said softly. Troy nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Together." The plan unfolded with terrifying speed. Troy sprinted out of the facility, the decoy tier clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't look back as the assassins spotted him, their glowing eyes locking onto the faint pulse of the decoy. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding as he ran toward the dense forest. Behind him, the assassins moved with inhuman speed, their weapons lighting up as they fired bursts of energy that tore through the trees. Troy ducked and weaved, his breath ragged as he pushed his body to its limits. From the shadows, Zara struck. She moved like a phantom, her energy pulses catching one of the assassins in the back and sending him sprawling. The other two turned, their weapons snapping up to fire at her, but she was already gone, disappearing into the trees. The assassins hesitated, torn between chasing Troy and dealing with Zara. It was all the opening Troy needed. He reached the ridge overlooking the valley, his chest heaving as he turned to face the assassins. "Hey!" he shouted, holding the decoy aloft. "Looking for this." The remaining two assassins snarled, their glowing eyes narrowing as they advanced toward him. Troy's grip tightened on the decoy. "Zara," he muttered under his breath. "Any time now." A sudden burst of violet energy erupted from the tree line, striking one of the assassins and sending him flying. The last assassin turned, his weapon raised, but Zara was already on him, her movements a blur as she drove her blade into his chest. The assassin collapsed, his weapon clattering to the ground. Troy let out a shaky breath, lowering the decoy. "Remind me never to piss you off." Zara stepped toward him, her chest heaving as she wiped blood from her lip. "Are you hurt?" "No," Troy said, his voice softening. "Are you?" She shook her head, but her gaze lingered on him, a mixture of relief and exhaustion in her eyes. "It's over," she said quietly. "For now," Troy replied. He glanced at the decoy in his hand, then at Zara. "What about the tier? What happens next?" Zara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the real tier on her belt. "The resistance will come," she said. "They'll protect it, and if the council tries to retaliate." Her voice trailed off, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. "We'll be ready." Troy nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Guess I'm sticking around then." Zara's expression softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Together they turned toward the horizon, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so uncertain. And as they walked side by side, the tear glowing faintly at Zara's side, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.